Welcome to the debate. When we picture a hostage situation, we usually think of bank vaults, we think of armed guards, locked doors, and physical perimeters. But the most devastating, intricate hostage situations don't actually happen in bank vaults. They happen in living rooms.
Exactly. And because the bars of that cage are entirely invisible, the people trapped inside often don't even realize they've been taken hostage at all.
Today, we are investigating the hidden world of coercive control, specifically focusing on the invisible manipulation systems of covert narcissists. The central question we are exploring today is how we actually understand the victim's psychological state within that invisible cage.
Right, because it's a profound psychological mystery. When someone is subjected to severe, systematic manipulation over years, what is actually happening to their mind?
Exactly. Are we looking at a complete erasure of their identity, like a literal dismantling of the self? Or are we looking at something else entirely, an active, neurobiologically driven survival strategy that's fueled by chemical addiction?
It really is the tension between sociological brainwashing and clinical neurobiology. Does the self disappear, or does it just go into hiding?
Well, I'll be analyzing this from a behavioral and forensic perspective, drawing on sociological frameworks like Evan Stark's work and Albert Bitterman's chart of coercion. I argue that coercive control fundamentally dismantles the self. It results in what we call perspecticide.
Perspecticide.
Right. The systematic, cognitive erasure of the victim's autonomous identity. The abuser completely overwrites their reality.
And I will be coming at this from the perspective of trauma and neurobiology. While the abuser's tactics are, as you said, incredibly systematic, the victim's identity is not simply erased into a blank slate.
You don't think so?
No, I don't. Instead, victims undergo an active neurobiological hijack. Their nervous system adapts to survive intermittent threats. So they forcefully subordinate the self to a trauma bond, which functions exactly like a profound addiction.
To really understand this, I think we have to look at the covert nature of the entrapment. Most people completely miss this when they think of abuse. They look for the black eye, or the broken bone.
The obvious physical markers.
Exactly. But covert control often begins hidden beneath this veneer of intense sensitivity, or victimhood, or even humility on the part of the abuser. At first glance, this seems harmless. But here's what most victims never realize. The abuser is data mining. They are mapping your vulnerabilities.
Oh, absolutely. They find out exactly what you're afraid of.
Yes. And then they deploy tactics originally designed to break prisoners of war.
You're referring to Bitterman's chart of coercion, right? The framework that mapped how American POWs were broken during the Korean War.
That's the one. Isolation, degradation, the monopolization of perception. But let's bring it into the living room, because the pattern becomes much darker when you zoom out. Imagine being interrogated for 4 hours at 2 in the morning because you bought the wrong brand of orange juice.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that specific scenario is chillingly common.
Right, and the abuser isn't just yelling. They are clinically breaking down your reality, demanding you admit you bought it to spite them. Then you have to wake up at 6 a.m. to get the kids to school, pretending everything is completely normal.
Which is just exhausting.
Exactly. If you do that for a year, your brain stops fighting back just to get some sleep. The abuser is deliberately exhausting your cognitive defenses to overwrite your operating reality. You literally lose the capacity to know what you know. And that, to me, is perspecticide.
Well, the exhaustion is absolutely real. And that 2 a.m. interrogation scenario, I hear about that in clinical practice all the time. But I don't see that as the abuser simply overriding a blank mind. We have to look at the hidden mechanism driving the victim's compliance here.
Okay, what mechanism?
Those tactics only succeed because they exploit the brain's reward prediction error.
How so? Walk us through the biology of that.
Think about a slot machine. You don't get a payout every single time you pull the lever. If you did, you'd get bored and walk away, right?
Sure.
It's the unpredictability, the mere possibility of the win that gets you hooked. The abuser's affection works exactly the same way in the brain. A relationship with a covert manipulator almost always begins with intense love bombing. They present themselves as the ultimate antidote to all your past trauma.
Which creates the baseline dependency.
Right, exactly. So when that sudden, bizarre 2 a.m. interrogation happens, The brain is thrown into absolute chaos. Your cortisol spikes. You are terrified. But then, eventually, the abuser offers a moment of warmth.
The payout.
Yes. Maybe they cry. Maybe they apologize and say they were just so terrified of losing you. That reconciliation phase floods the brain with dopamine and oxytocin. A deep biological dependency is formed where the abuser becomes associated with both the terrifying threat and the profound physical relief. You aren't just exhausted, you are chemically tethered to the perpetrator.
I hear that, but doesn't that addiction model somewhat soften the reality of the cognitive destruction taking place? I mean, this isn't just someone chasing a dopamine hit. We're talking about the systematic dismantling of a person's sanity through tactics like DARVO.
Deny, attack, reverse victim and offender.
Precisely. Let's break down that behavioral algorithm because it is incredibly insidious. You confront the abuser with a fact. They deny it ever happened. Then they attack your credibility or your memory.
Right.
And finally, they reverse the roles, claiming that your accusation proves you are the abusive, untrustworthy one. Suddenly, you are the one apologizing. Combine that with chronic gaslighting, and you aren't just chemically addicted, you are lost in a funhouse mirror maze.
That is a brilliant way to describe it. A funhouse mirror maze.
At first, when you walk into the maze, you know the mirrors are distorted. You know your reflection is warped. But if the abuser locks you in that maze for 5 years and isolates you so you never see a normal mirror again, your brain eventually accepts the distorted reflections as the literal, objective truth.
I see where you're going with this.
The victim's internal database of reality is corrupted. That's why I argue the self is fundamentally erased. They aren't actively adapting anymore. Their mind has been taken hostage and replaced.
Well, I disagree that the mind is replaced or erased. That idea of a corrupted database, it kind of ignores the physiological reality of how the brain processes trauma.
How do you mean?
During periods of intense fear or chronic stress, the hippocampus, which is the brain region responsible for organizing memories into a coherent timeline, literally changes how it functions.
So you're saying the memory fragmentation is biological, not just the result of the gaslighting?
It's both, but the biological response is highly protective. The hippocampus stops recording a continuous linear story. Instead, it captures fragments, sensory flashes.
Like a smell or a sound?
Exactly. The victim might remember the exact pattern of the wallpaper during an incident, or the specific tone of the abuser's voice, but completely forget what month it happened or how the argument started. That isn't the abuser successfully deleting the victim's mind. That is the victim's brain actively prioritizing immediate survival over chronological memory storage.
Okay, but
The confusion isn't emptiness. It's a symptom of a highly active, severely dysregulated nervous system trying to process a constant state of threat.
let's look at how that internal chaos actually manifests in the victim's daily behavior, because we see profound learned helplessness. When an abuser micromanages trivial demands, monitoring your phone calls, demanding passwords, insisting on approving your outfits or your social plans, the victim eventually just stops trying to make choices.
Right, they stop initiating action.
Exactly. They conclude that they are fundamentally incapable of surviving outside the relationship. The abuser monopolizes their perception to the point where the victim's own desires, opinions, and preferences fade entirely. They don't know what music they like, they don't know what food they enjoy.
Yeah.
It's a structural collapse of the will. That behavioral paralysis is the hallmark of prospecticide. The self is gone.
Okay, wait. Let me pause you right there. Because interpreting that behavioral paralysis as a collapse of the will or loss of self is a fundamental mischaracterization of what's happening clinically. What you are describing as paralysis is actually fawning.
Fawning, as in the trauma response. Like fight, flight, freeze, and fawn?
Exactly. And fawning is a highly active, incredibly complex nervous system response. The victim's amygdala is hyperactivated. They aren't empty. They are constantly scanning the abuser's mood. They notice the slight shift in tone, the micro-expression of contempt, the specific way the abuser puts down a coffee mug.
reading the room to an extreme degree.
Yes, they process this massive amount of data instantaneously, and they preemptively adjust their behavior to pacify the abuser and avoid harm.
So you're saying the abandonment of their own needs is a calculated choice?
Well, it's an unconscious survival calculation. They abandon their own needs not because those needs have been erased, but because prioritizing their own needs would trigger an attack. It's threat management in overdrive. The self is forced into hiding to keep the organism alive.
That's a really compelling clinical framing, but I have to push back on it. If this is merely an active, protective survival strategy, why do victims go so far as to adopt the abuser's most toxic labels for them?
What do you mean?
Well, in cases of severe coercive control, you see victims who used to be confident, independent professionals suddenly believing they're inherently stupid, worthless, or crazy simply because the abuser repeated it enough times.
Right, the profound internalization of the abuse.
Yes, if the self is actively surviving in the background, as you say, why is the core identity the very first casualty? Why do they adopt the abuser's ideology as their own even when it directly contradicts everything they used to stand for? I mean, that goes way beyond fawning to avoid a fight. That is the rewriting of the soul.
It looks like a rewriting of the soul, but psychologically it's actually cognitive dissonance resolution. And it's a tragic, desperate adaptation.
Go on.
Let's look at the psychological tension the victim is under. If you believe your abuser is a monster, but you are physically or financially unable to leave them, the psychological tension, the cognitive dissonance is unbearable. The human brain cannot sustain that level of terror 24/7.
So the brain changes the narrative to survive the environment?
Precisely. If you convince yourself that you are the problem, that you are the one who needs to be fixed, it actually gives you a false sense of control.
Oh, interesting.
Right? It tells the brain, if I just act better, if I just become less selfish, the abuse will stop. Adopting those negative labels is the ego's way of maintaining some illusion of safety and agency in an entirely inescapable situation.
Well, that brings up a critical point, the inescapability of the situation. Because the mechanisms of entrapment aren't just happening inside the victim's head. The cage is structurally enforced by the abuser in the real world.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about isolation. A covert narcissist doesn't usually start by physically locking you in a room. They use narcissistic triangulation.
Pitting people against each other.
Exactly. They manufacture smear campaigns. They tell the victim, your friends are actually jealous of you. Your family doesn't really care about you. They're just using you. I'm the only one who truly understands you.
The false savior complex.
Yes. And then they create constant conflict right before social events. So the victim eventually feels too exhausted to maintain those outside relationships. They just stop going out.
It genuinely becomes easier to stay home than to pay the psychological price of leaving the house.
Right. And then you add financial abuse to that, putting debt in the victim's name, restricting access to bank accounts, ruining their credit score. The entrapment becomes a tangible social and economic reality. The victim looks around and realizes there is literally no outside world left to escape to. No money, no friends, no credibility. The abuser has engineered a reality where dependence is mandatory.
I completely agree that the structural barriers are intentionally constructed and devastatingly real. But if we look at the clinical reality of how victims actually leave, it complicates the idea that the cage is purely structural.
In what way?
Research consistently shows that survivors of abusive relationships return an average of 7 times before leaving for good.
7 times.
7 times. Think about what that really means. If the entrapment was purely structural, just about money or physical isolation, then once a victim finally breaks out, gets a restraining order, and gets into a domestic violence shelter, they would stay away. The structural barrier has been breached, the physical threat is mitigated, but they return.
And you're arguing they return because of the trauma bond.
Yes, because of the withdrawal. The anxiety of being away from the abuser feels vastly more dangerous to their dysregulated nervous system than the reality of the abuse itself. They physically return to the living room to seek neurochemical relief from the exact person causing their terror.
That's a horrifying paradox.
It is. The betrayal trauma is so deep exactly because the person you rely on for survival is the one violating you. And I think that proves the trauma bond, the emotional addiction, is the primary mechanism of entrapment.
I'll concede that the chemical withdrawal is a massive factor. But, doesn't focusing so heavily on the addiction model inadvertently minimize the calculated external coercion?
How so?
Think about it. If an abuser has used a smear campaign so effectively that the victim's family genuinely believes the victim is crazy, returning isn't just a neurochemical craving.
You're saying it's a practical calculation.
It is the only structurally available option for survival. If you leave but you are facing homelessness, your credit is destroyed, and your own mother thinks you're the abuser one because the covert narcissist has charmed her, returning is a deeply rational choice based on the scorched earth environment the abuser has created. To say they go back for a dopamine hit feels like it absolves the abuser of the very real, tangible prison they built.
No, I don't think it absolves the abuser at all. In fact, it exposes the deepest, darkest layer of their manipulation. The abuser engineered the addiction. When we analyze covert manipulation, we are looking at someone who systematically data mines your fears, like we talked about earlier. They weaponize your deepest insecurities. Yes, the structural cage is real, but the reason the invisible cage is so flawlessly effective is because the abuser manipulates the victim's neurobiology so that the victim wants to stay in the cage, or at least genuinely feels they will die outside of it. Acknowledging the trauma bond highlights just how deeply the abuser has penetrated the victim's psychological infrastructure.
Okay, well, let's look at what happens when the cage finally does open, when the victim actually stays away, because I think the recovery process reveals the sheer magnitude of the erasure that took place.
The aftermath.
Yeah. When survivors of coercive control describe their early days of freedom, they don't just say they feel sad or anxious. They say things like, "I felt like I didn't exist," or "I looked in the mirror and felt like there was no one behind my eyes."
The loss of self-concept is profound.
A total void. Dr. Lisa Aronson-Fontes, who writes extensively on this, utilizes the recovery acronym to help victims rebuild. And the very first steps involve reclaiming activities the abuser forbade. It's literally a process of remembering how to have a preference. What do I want to eat? What clothes do I actually like?
Right.
If the self was just hiding and managing threats like you suggest, wouldn't it simply reemerge once the threat was gone? Why do they have to rebuild the personality from scratch?
Well, they don't reemerge instantly because the nervous system doesn't know the threat is gone. You can remove the victim from the abuser, but you haven't yet removed the abuser from the victim's nervous system. Survivors of this kind of long-term manipulation almost always suffer from complex PTSD.
Which is fundamentally different from a single event PTSD diagnosis.
Exactly. CPTSD involves persistent emotional dysregulation, an incredibly harsh inner critic, and a shattered self-concept. The reason they don't know who they are isn't because the self was deleted. It's because their entire neurobiological bandwidth has been consumed by survival for years, sometimes decades.
Wow.
When you spend 10 years fawning, you turn off the circuitry for preferences. You stop asking, what do I want? And you only ask, what do they want me to want?
So the circuitry is dormant, not destroyed.
Right. Reclaiming those simple activities, choosing a meal, buying a shirt, isn't downloading a new operating system. It's providing the nervous system with enough consistent safety to finally turn off the threat radar. Only when the hypervigilance settles can the dormant self safely speak again. The void they feel isn't an absence of identity. It's the deafening silence of a nervous system that finally has nothing to fight.
So we are looking at a deeply complex interplay between external subjugation and internal adaptation. It seems the truth requires both frameworks to fully grasp. My core position remains that coercive control is an intentional, calculated regime of psychological torture. By controlling the environment, micromanaging daily life, and monopolizing perception, abusers achieve perspecticide. They dismantle the victim's autonomous reality, creating a systemic hostage situation where the chains are cognitive.
And my position is that to truly support survivors, we must view this dynamic through the clinical lens of the trauma bond. The intermittent reinforcement of abuse and affection hijacks the brain's threat and reward systems. The victim is not a blank slate or a deleted hard drive. Their nervous system is performing incredibly complex, active threat management. The self is forced into hiding to survive a profound betrayal trauma.
Despite our different lenses, we converge on a crucial, undeniable reality. Coercive control is one of the most severe, devastating forms of abuse imaginable. It inflicts deep psychological trauma, often resulting in complex PTSD, severe anxiety, and a total disruption of a person's life trajectory, all without requiring a single act of physical violence. It is an invisible crime that leaves catastrophic injuries.
It absolutely is. And understanding both the sociological framework of how the cage is built and the neurobiological reality of why the brain adapts to it is really the only way to validate the survivor's experience. It explains the impossible trap they were placed in, and it honors the incredible resilience their brain showed in keeping them alive.
There is still so much more to explore in this material, particularly regarding how our society, our families, and our legal systems can better recognize these patterns before it's too late. We are so conditioned to look for the physical evidence of a hostage situation. We look for the bank vault. We look for the locked doors. But the most terrifying captivity is the one where the front door is wide open, yet the mind is completely trapped.
Because when the cage is built out of your own neurochemistry and a manipulated reality, you carry the bank vault with you wherever you go.
A chilling reality, and one we all need to be better equipped to recognize in our own lives and the lives of those we love. Thank you for joining us on The Debate. Keep questioning, keep seeking different perspectives, and we will see you next time.